Hello, everybody. Today, I have the privilege of having a conversation with my friend, Peggy Reynoso. Peggy is a wonderful friend and mentor to so many of us in the Navigators. And together with Alan Andrews and others, they put together a wonderful book titled The Kingdom Life, in which Peggy wrote a chapter on the topic of suffering. And just recently, Peggy and I were together in San Diego in her home with her husband, Paul, and reminiscing about their years as a missionary and their ministry to the navigators and leader development. And one thing she said to me was, we really need to help the next generation of emerging leaders to have a better biblical and experiential understanding of the topic of suffering. And so that's the origin of this interview. So let me see if I can bring Peggy in here. There's Peggy. Good morning, Peggy. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Peggy, could you just take a minute and introduce yourself? Tell us about your family and about your role.
Sure. So I work in TDC and in with the design team. Paul and I live in San Diego now, and it is the joy of my life. Uh, Honestly, is getting to coach people by Zoom, and I'm so glad that I've been able to continue to work with TDC even since we moved out here. Paul and I have four children, who all of whom were born in Mexico, and most of whom were raised there. We moved to Mexico as newlyweds in 1973, and ministered with the Navigators for 20 years there. Our kids, of course, now are adults and middle-aged adults, and we have three sons and a daughter. Our daughter is already in heaven, and that's the reason that I'm here to talk about this subject, because of how profoundly God used suffering in my own life.
In the introduction to your chapter on suffering, this quote, it was the first line in the chapter. It just struck me very deeply. It says, "Spiritual formation occurs when God in his grace invades the destructiveness of suffering that results from the fall of man and uses the pain of suffering for his redemptive purposes in his people." There's a lot to unpackage here, but I thought maybe a place for us to start would be with your own journey. It sounds like you've had your own journey with suffering, and the Lord has used that to transform you as a leader. I just invite you to share what's been your journey in this area.
It started after we moved back to the United States, and it was in from Mexico. And God kind of let us know we that hard times were coming. It was interesting that He did that. But we went through a period of about 10 years of just kind of one hard thing after another. Um, it started when Paul was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer, and his doctor didn't want to treat him. He said, instead, let's just make your last months as comfortable as possible. And we kind of got second opinions on that, and Paul ended up going through treatment. God healed him. But it was a very hard couple of years. We just didn't know if he was going to live, and we grieved his impending death, really for a couple of years while he was going through very difficult treatments. And then after that, it just seemed like we had one health challenge after another as a family. Our son, who lived in Boston, David, had repeated lung collapses, and I would go up and nurse him back to health and be with him in Boston. And I had a couple of kind of tough things. I was diagnosed with bilateral dystonia in my hands, and it's progressive, and I no longer can write anymore, that kind of thing. And then also, I had a heart problem. I developed atrial flutter. I would pass out, had to have an ablation done, and that really made a big difference. But just it was just kind of one thing after another, and all of our friends were like, "Oh my goodness, what's going on with the Reynosos?" It was really kind of like a Job experience. Our oldest son during that time was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was living in another city, married, and his wife left him, and he moved back home with us. We had 6 very, very difficult years until we found a medication that really worked for him. But during those 6 years, our daughter, our youngest child, developed this really weird illness. She'd wake up in the night and vomiting. And at first it was episodic, like maybe once every 3 weeks. And then it was once every 2 weeks, and it was once a week. And then soon it was every night. She would have quite a bit of pain with it as well and be vomiting for 2 or 3 hours. She dreaded to go to bed at night. It was just really hard. I took her to doctors really all over the U.S. Trying to find a diagnosis and a cure. We never did find out. She got just a little bit better, and after she graduated from high school, and when she started college, she was more doing better. She had been through depression the previous 4 months, and those were really scary times. But she was doing better, and then about a month after she started university, she was killed in a car accident. And we had been through all these hard times, and it seemed like suffering. But this was so far beyond any of that it just didn't compare at all. And in the months leading up to Paula's death, God was just silent with Paul and me. He really did not speak to us. That in and of itself was just so very hard.
Mm.
But after Paula's death, God made up for it in spades. He just poured himself out to me and spoke to me and really met me in my grief and my suffering. So, yeah, it was a period of time that made a big difference, I think, in shaping us into the people that we are.
Thank you for sharing. And what a gift to us to hear your journey. Um, I don't, it's just hard to know how to respond when someone has experienced all these things in ways that many of us have not. But thank you for sharing that with us. That's very powerful. I'm curious to hear more about how did God use this experience to really contribute to for you, Peggy, in your own personal growth.
There's something about suffering that it kind of strips you down to your essential self, and it puts you in touch with your heart in a way that normally we are not in touch with our inner selves. You just don't have any pretense left. And I had no solutions, no way I could work my way out of this. And so it really caused me to reach deep within myself and to process all of this with God. That chapter on suffering in the kingdom life, that came a couple of years after Paula died, but it really came out of all of that processing I did with him and bringing my questions to him. And God just, like I said, he just poured out himself to me, and he truly grieved with me. My daughter was a real jokester, and she was great fun. And I'm sure at the same time that he was laughing at her jokes, he was crying with me. And he has the ability to do that. I feel like God truly did grieve with me. That may sound a little strange, but it really was not just my imagination. And I've really come to learn that God probably grieves all of the time over
Mm,
the brokenness and the hurt in our world. In fact, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that he thinks that God is nearer to suffering than to happiness. And to find God in the way of suffering gives peace and rest and a strong and courageous heart. And that was true for me. Um, it didn't come overnight, but somehow in going through that process with all my questions and hurt with God, it really changed me and
mm,
gave me a centeredness and a trust in Him that I didn't have before.
mm. From our time in Japan, one expression the Japanese have is as a leader grows, the corner, like a corners on a table, the corners become rounded off a bit. And after
That's
our
good.
time in Japan for 25 years, some people said, "Oh, Mark, your experiences in Japan have kind of rounded you off a bit and softened you a bit as a leader." I'm so thankful for that, and they were
That's
mostly
funny.
unpleasant experiences. I'm curious for you, how has suffering, how has this shaped your approach to leadership and your ability to guide others as they have their own struggles?
I think it uh, causes me to make space for grieving, um, to grieve losses, to kind of slow down and process things as you go through life. And I give others the space to do that a lot more than I used to. I certainly give myself the space to do that more than I used to. And I'm more patient with people. Just the way God wired me, I'm pretty fast and I like to do things fast. Um, and this kind of slowed me down and it opened me up to the pain of other people, probably more than anything else. I felt like I entered a fellowship of suffering that I did not want to join, but I began to my or at least my awareness of suffering in the world was really heightened,
Mm,
and I recognized other people who had been desperate once
mm,
I had reached that point myself. And it's just interesting, even today, it's been 17 years since Paula died. It's like I recognize in people whether or not they've really been desperate in life. And you just can, I don't know, you just can see it in them.
mm. I heard from what you just shared just a greater ability to provide empathic presence to people. This has changed you inside in a way that you're able to enter into those who look to you for leadership with empathy. I wanted to ask you about this word lament as well. It's a trending word now. People talk about lamenting. What is lament, and what role does it play in the practice of wrestling through in suffering?
Well, we certainly see lament in the scriptures, right? The psalmists lamented, the prophets lamented. Um, but I think we need to be a little careful with that word lament because it kind of spiritualizes what we really mean is to grieve. And it's the prophets and the psalmists were grieving some losses when they wrote about their grief. And when I was going through really hard times, and both Paul and I, the Psalms really spoke to us. It was a place that we could worship God through grieving. And oftentimes in the church, that wasn't true. Um, because there's so much, kind of rejoicing and always kind of beat type things. It really gave us a place to grieve and worship. But I think somehow, if we think of lamenting, it sounds like something a little bit alien to us. And it's something that we do artificially. Oh, I should lament. And really, in grieving, you are speaking from the depths of your heart and bringing your real self to God. So I think that is what we need to do more of, be in touch with the depths of our heart and be able to bring that to God.
Thank you. You shared a story in your chapter about from the Philip Yancey book, a story about a man who was struggling with cancer and had a dark night of the soul. Can you recount that story in your own words?
Oh, it's so powerful, right? I guess Yancey was talking about a chaplain, was talking, he was like a hospice chaplain, was talking with this man who had terminal cancer. And when he met with him, the man was just overcome by guilt and fear because all the night before he had been up all night ranting and raving and cursing God um, for all that had befallen him. And now he was afraid that God was going to reject him because of the things he had said to him. The chaplain said, "What do you think is the opposite of love?" And the man said, "Hate." And the chaplain said, "No, it's not. It's indifference." He said, "What you have been doing all night is
Mm.
praying. You have been talking to God." And that was, I felt like that really described what I experienced after the death of my daughter.
Mm. What a beautiful invitation just to bring everything that we have to the Lord. He can handle. He can handle it, and I love that. Apathy is the thing that's the opposite of love. So is beautiful. Lastly, I just there's so many things we could talk about, but I did want to ask your advice. Some of our members are maybe in the midst of their own dark night of the soul. What I know we're always hesitant to give advice to someone when they are suffering, but what would you say to someone who is really struggling to understand the role, the purpose of suffering in their own journey?
Well, this may sound a little bad, but I would encourage when you are in really difficult times to not accept Christian truths too easily. Bring your questions, find more answers, process them with God, because that is where the gold lies in suffering, is that process of bringing things to God. Think through your own theology of suffering. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Why did he allow it to happen to you? And how are you going to make it through with him? Journal, write, talk things through, get out and go for walks, whatever works for you, and best processing stuff with God. Um, Another thing, though, that I saw, that sometimes people were too quick to say, "Oh, this is why God is doing this.
Mm.
He is allowing this so that this good thing can happen." And I found that um, people are a little bit too glib sometimes in doing that. It's surfacey. God is much more intelligent than we are. He's so much more complex than we are. He's omni everything. We just cannot understand really what he's like. And his ways are not our ways. Sometimes the suffering that we go through, the reason for it may be for the next generation or people we don't even know. But God has his purposes and he will accomplish those things. But a lot of times we may not know why.
It's
I think
great.
in part, we do that because we're trying to find a reason, right, to justify
Yeah.
and for it to be worth it to go through all this. But yeah.
Yeah, Job's journey seems to really be in play. Job and his friends just wanting to diagnose why did this suffering happen. So I hear from you, just be patient with that, and God's timing is different than our timing. Um, well, Peggy, thank you so much for taking time to do this interview. And just for, I personally want to say thank you for being a person who's modeled really continuing to draw near to God in suffering and to lean in to the Lord and stay close to Him through suffering. And for many of us, you are a leader who embodies that, and God is using that powerfully as you mentor many of us and develop us in our leadership. So thank you so much for this time together. Was there anything else you wanted to add or say?
Um, like people say, you have a choice when you're going through hard things, right? And you can be bitter, you can withdraw from God, or you can draw close to Him. And there are riches in that. So you can get bitter or you can get better. But it's it's not an easy thing. But just it's a way that God grows us in trust, and I'm very grateful for the life that He's given me.
Thank you very much,
Thanks, Mark.
sister, for this time.